Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the 8th episode of the story, and when Naruto's father met his mother, his first thought was that a village out there must be missing its idiot. This story is from Silver Shine. Please support him, her. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. What Minato had previously thought of as love, in its unrequited form, turned out to be the pale, anemic shadow of the real thing. To love someone was one thing, but to love and be loved in return was like stumbling upon the answer to the meaning of life, a question that staid-old philosophers had spent their lives asking and Minato had stumbled upon unintentionally. Here were all the things that mattered in the world: Kushina's smile, Kushina's laugh, Kushina's hand seeking his. Minato had been in relationships before and never once felt the charged connection he now felt with Kushina, where every time he looked at her his heart raced and he wondered if he was dreaming and when he would wake up. The journey back from Whirlpool was the easiest Minato had ever made. He barely noticed the distance they traveled or the landmarks they passed, only that Kushina was with him every step of the way like a guiding light. On the one hand, it was like nothing between them had changed and she chattered away like a monkey, happier than he'd seen her in weeks, his familiar best friend. But it was different also, in that he could stop and kiss her whenever he felt like it and she didn't seem to mind. In fact, she seemed to quite enjoy it, when she wasn't doing the same to him. The trip to Konoha might have taken a little longer than expected, due to all the frequent pauses, but Minato knew it was a memory he was going to take to the grave as one of the best days in his life. More enlivening than the glory of victory over one of the 7 swordsmen. More exhilarating than all his battles combined. It was easy to forget everything and everyone else in the world when Kushina looped her arm through his and grinned at him like she was the happiest girl in the world. Knowing he was the one who'd brought out this amazing smile of hers certainly made him the happiest boy. But she dimmed a little when they finally began their approach toward the village gates. She must have known from the moment she set out that there would be in a whole pile of trouble when she returned, if she had even originally planned on returning. Her hand clenched his tightly as if she could suck all his support and courage right out through his palm, though as soon as they were within sight of gates she slipped away to a distance that could have been measured in platonic units. Minato let her go. He had no problem with public displays of affection, but he knew perfectly well that there were other attachments she would have to deal with before she could be seen holding his hand in public. And that attachment's name was Sarutobi Run. He should have felt bad about stealing another man's girl away, right from under his nose, but Minato felt remarkably good about the fact. One could argue he was only taking back what Ran had stolen from him originally. "You found her then," said one of the guards at the gate, speaking of Kushina as if she was nothing more than an errant cat. "That's good. We had a bet on to see who would bring her back first." He gestured to his deflated comrades sulking near the reception office. "They bet Sarutobi-senpai would catch her first. It didn't cross your mind that neither would be able to catch me?" Kushina asked sharply. The guard stared at her, nonplussed. "You're here, aren't you?" "Because I choose to be." "Right." Kushina raised her hand to give him another piece of her mind, or to beat him around the head. Minato quickly caught it and pulled her along. "Must be getting along now," he called cheerfully, before she could initiate a brawl. "The Hokage will be relieved to know you're safe and sound." "Of course, I am," she gasped indignantly. "Why wouldn't I be?" And although the Hokage was relieved, he was also palpably worst of all, he was disappointed. The moment Minato and Kushina had entered his office he'd heaved a painful sigh as if some terrible catastrophe had been averted and then settled back to fix Kushina with a look like a teacher about to slip into a lecture about being let down. Because that was exactly where the Hokage was going, Minato was pointedly thanked and excused, for Kushina had to face this trial alone. Minato didn't go far. Though he was denied the opportunity to press his ear to the Hokage's chamber and find out what exactly it was about Kushina that made the Hokage fear her so much, too many witnesses, he lingered in the lobby downstairs. News must have spread pretty quickly that Uzumaki Kushina was back in town, as Ren came storming through soon after. Minato actually tried to duck out of sight when he saw the younger Sarutobi coming. Ren couldn't possibly have known what Minato had been doing with his girlfriend for the best part of the last 2 days, and yet Minato still got the sense that, witnesses or no, Ren would deck him right now if he saw him. It was another half an hour before Kushina reappeared, though he heard her angry voice descending the stairs before he saw her. "I never asked you to. You could have at least told me where you were going. I don't have to tell you anything. I wanted to be alone. You had the whole village on high alert just because you wanted to be alone, Kushina, not my problem. It was irresponsible." "No, irresponsible is running off to Kumo to start accusing them of kidnap. I was worried about you. And you thought I was as helpless as to get caught by Kumanin. Not even Minato is stupid enough to think that." What did she mean by, not even? Minato, Minato, Minato. Ren shouted his name loud enough that half the people in the entrance hall turned and looked at him. Minato himself sidled further behind a potted plant. "Everyone just loves Minato, don't they? Stop it. You're being ridiculous." "Am I? My girlfriend lives with the overhyped village pinup and spends more time with him than she does with me. What have I got to worry about? If you don't trust me, fine. You won't have to worry about that, and I won't have to worry about protecting your ego if we're not together anymore. So that's that." Ren was left stunned on the steps, and with her piece said, Kushina carried on without him. She sailed past Minato's plant. "Come on, Minato, we're going." He followed meekly. Despite the grudge he'd harbored against Sarutobi Ren, which perhaps never would have been the case if he'd had the decency to fall for someone else, he sympathized a little. He'd just been quite publicly dumped by Uzumaki Kushina, and even though she had insisted that he didn't love her anymore, Minato was pretty sure only a man in love could look that heartbroken. But that was nothing to how Kushina felt. Minato followed her homeward, keeping all his bursting questions to himself. What had the Hokage said to her? Were things really over between her and Ren now? Would another kiss be considered too soon? Halfway to nowhere, Kushina suddenly pivoted and tried to march right back the way they'd come, and would have if Minato hadn't caught her to stop her plowing into him. "I have to go apologize," she said, looking like she had the day the yellow flasher had died. "I lost my temper, and I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have said those things, not like that." "You want to undo the breakup?" he asked, heart palpitating in his chest. He didn't know what he'd do if Kushina suddenly gave up before their relationship had even started. No, it was the right thing to do, but the wrong way to do it. Kushina put her face in her hands. And worst of all, he was right. "I am selfish and irresponsible, and he was right not to trust me with you because look what happened. I cheated on him." "Only very briefly," he said reassuringly. "I didn't set out to humiliate him like that, Minato," she sighed. "And I don't want to hurt him." "Ren's a big boy," Minato told her, reaching out to take her hands. "I'm sure he'll get over it." Her cool fingers squeezed around his briefly, and before she slipped her hands out of reach behind her back she flashed him a sad, half-smile half-grimace. "Yeah, but, for now, maybe we shouldn't tell anyone about us. It feels like we'd be rubbing it in his face." The palpitations were getting worse. "You want to keep our relationship a secret?" This was not something he was used to hearing. "Just for a while. I don't want Ren to think I had you lined up ready to go," she said feelingly. "It's not a problem, is it? I was kinda planning on shouting it from the rooftops later," he admitted. "I know. I feel the same way, but let's keep it between us for now." He wasn't in a strong position to argue. After having just caught the elusive wisp between his fingers, he was convinced that the slightest upset could make him lose her again. That didn't mean he couldn't have fun with her, however. "Oh, I get it," he said, affecting a wounded expression. "You're ashamed of me." For a moment she looked startled, as if she was about to launch into desperate reassurances, when she suddenly laughed. The idea of being ashamed of him was too absurd for her to believe. More like I'm worried for my own life. Do you know how much people hated Yoshi when you were dating her? There was at least one death threat a week. Wow, really? Yes. I sent most of them. Minato touched his chest. That's so sweet. He had the very strong urge to kiss her beaming face right then, but if she wouldn't let him do it in public. Let's go home, he said suddenly, steering her very fast towards the direction of their street. Why? She asked, mystified by his sudden urgency. I want to cook you dinner, he lied. Kushina audibly gulped. She clearly remembered his cooking. How about I make us dinner from now on? Regardless of all that had happened, the village's high alert, the Hokage's cryptic words about Kushina's condition, the disappearance of the Kazekage and the turbulent international relations that echoed the heralds of previous wars, and the fact that his girlfriend didn't want to be seen in public with him, Minato felt like the happiest, luckiest man in the world. Because Kushina's cooking could solve all those problems in her own way. Her food was that good. Konoha was moving through a time of great changes, and one such change concerned Namikaze Minato, though noted only by those around him. If asked, anyone would have said Minato was a pleasant guy and a good companion to have around, and if you needed a good team leader, he was your man if a little intense, but since coming back from his mission to rescue Uzumaki Kushina, there was a new life to him. Bemused friends drew around him like rats to the Pied Piper. There had always been something about Minato that had attracted people. Now he simply made them fall in love with him on sight. The middle-aged librarian, who had never really noticed Minato any more than the other young shinobi who came to study her books on combat, was shocked by the arrival of this blonde beatific angel that appeared at her desk asking for books on the history of the Whirlpool Nation. He smiled at her, enthused his love for her knitted cardigan, called her by the name on her badge, and quite unwittingly had her privately planning his marriage to her daughter by the time he finally left the library with all the reference books he desired. The likes of Chuza, Inoichi, and Shikaku, who had once been absolutely convinced that all Minato's woes were intrinsically related to the state of his virginity, decided he must finally have gotten laid. Without ever confirming if it was true or not, Minato accepted their beer and congratulations while carefully trying to stop the rumor from reaching Hatake Tsukumo's ears, who was better at adding 2 and 2 together than 3 chimps. Their relationship may have improved since the trip to Suna, but the ceasefire could be shattered by a reckless comment in front of an overprotective sensei. Maybe it was his subordinates who benefited the most. Previous missions under Minato were always meticulous affairs. Why rush a mission in one night when you could take 3 and prepare for every contingency? Minato regularly had his Chunin subordinates staking out bases and places of interest for more than 48 hours before allowing any kind of proactive move. These days Minato was more likely to lead the charge and drag everyone home before supper. It made exciting missions for the Chunin who trailed starry eyes in the wake of their team leader's rampage, but it was almost as if he had something or someone in Konoha he was eager to return to. As a man of his word, Minato didn't mention his relationship with Kushina to anyone. He thought the inordinate amount of time they spent together should have tipped them off, but no one regarded this as very different from how they'd behaved before. Outwardly, the affection they showed for one another hadn't changed. No wonder Ren had been so suspicious. A couple of people were bound to figure it out, however. Mikoto may never have said anything, but her eyes had a tendency to narrow whenever she saw Minato and Kushina in a room together, as if she sensed something had evolved between them and was too polite to broach the subject before they did. Little Kakashi probably knew too. Though they'd made it a game to see how many kisses they could steal behind his back when minding him for Tsukumo, sometimes the kid could turn around real fast. Jiraiya might have been alerted to the fact too by a slip of the tongue. He was by far the most astonished that Minato had gone from trying to blow him up upon his return to becoming the boy he had once taught before the war had snatched them away. He knew he hadn't been wrong about his student's potential when Minato came over one evening to raid his freezer in search ice cream for Kushina now that the shops were closed, and ended up staying well into the night once he had learned that Tsunade had decided to leave the village, taking only Dan's young niece with her to train as her protégé. "Can't handle the blood anymore," Jiraiya rumbled sadly. "And I can't convince her there's anything else to stay for." "Even if that's true now, perhaps all she needs is a little time," Minato told him. "I've found the best way to get a girl to come back home is to be honest about your feelings for her." "Is that so?" Jiraiya raised an eyebrow at him, and then smirked at himself. "Figures. I taught you well in the art of women, Minato, and now the student surpasses the master. Maybe I'll take your advice." But if he had, it never came to anything. Perhaps he never found the courage, or Tsunade rejected him. Either way, she left the village soon after with Shizune, and Minato never saw her again. The Sannin were broken, and the hole she left behind in Jiraiya was soon full of cheap booze. Minato hated to reap the benefit of another's misery, but perhaps without his sensei's desire to distract himself, he might never have taken a good, long look at his favorite pupil and decided Minato was now ready to inherit his summoning contract. Beyond them, their relationship was one of the best-kept secrets in the village, besides Kushina's secret, of course. But there were problems with their arrangement too. While Minato patiently waited for Kushina, who in turn was patiently waiting for Ren's heart to heal, he was, as far as the village was concerned, single. The good thing about dating Yoshi was that other girls had kept their distance out of respect, but the longer he denied having a girlfriend, the more persistent his would-be suitors became. Many times he'd found himself lured into conversation with a girl, only to belatedly realize that she wanted more from him than a friendly chat. Some of them were even quite forceful. For instance, he didn't really know what to do about AI. Since the first time she'd kissed him, she seemed to have these expectations. She was still as rude and antagonistic towards him as ever, yet she could switch to bold flirtations like a changing wind, and the latter was just as abusive as the former. In such instances Minato ended up embarrassed and paranoid. Suddenly he understood why Kushina was so cold to compliments. It wasn't a good feeling, not knowing if compliments or communes were genuine or just another way of mocking you. "She had her arm around me the whole time at the training yard," he told Kushina one evening as they watched TV with her head on his shoulder. "What am I supposed to say? You're too nice. Tell her to back off." She must have decided AI was no real threat. Hearing their boyfriend was being mauled by other women might have alarmed some girls, but nothing could get Kushina down these days. And as long as Kushina was happy, Minato was happy, and only occasionally vexed that any subtle attempt to talk about her condition felt like talking to a wall. The books he'd borrowed from the library weren't as informative as he'd hoped. As far as the historians were concerned, Whirlpool was a quaint former allied nation that had been destroyed by a civil war. The founder and original leader of Uzumaki had been a close ally of the first Hokage, and the two clans had intermarried according to one book. After that, relations had always been strong. The lives and rules of all the leaders of Whirlpool were outlined on the pages, and Kushina's father, the third leader, had the dubious honor of illustrating the entries about the beginning of the village's demise. He hadn't been the leader for very long, appointed quickly after the second leader had been killed when a catastrophic natural disaster hit the island, and he was noted only for failing to quell the subsequent unrest until he'd inevitably been killed in one of the first rebellions of the Civil War. He'd been succeeded by a fourth leader whose rule had been even shorter. The historians seemed to agree that Kushina's father was, at best, an ineffectual leader who'd sped up his village's decline, and at worst was directly responsible for it. This probably explained why his statue had been so badly defaced in Whirlpool. Was this really why Kushina didn't talk about her father? He supposed disliking your father because he destroyed your village made a lot of sense, but he'd been hoping for a more personal explanation that would have included Kushina's condition. Yet if it was personal stuff he wanted, history books weren't going to be much help. Excuse me? Minato replaced the balanced training katana back on the table and turned to the diffident voice behind him. Usually training like a dog and getting up a sweat put the girls off him, at least for an hour or two, but some could be awfully persistent. Hayagasan, he greeted her politely. What can I do for you? You know who I am? She looked so ready to faint from the shock that he didn't have the heart to tell her that he personally had no idea who she was. Her family just had a very distinctive look, and it was hard to imagine what other family someone with such pale eyes and dark hair could belong to. She must have only been about 15 or 16. No, you probably get asked this all the time, but was thinking, would you, with me? Minato took a deep breath and prepared to rattle off one of his more reliable excuses. Thank you for the interest, but right now I'm in between relationships. It's very flattering, but I'm still too hung up over my last girlfriend. You'll make someone a very happy human being one day, but right now I'm reassessing my orientation. I will get back to you. I mean, I expect you're very busy, the Hyuga girl rushed on. But I've just passed my Chunin exam, and I was hoping, probably unrealistically, that you'd, show me some tips on how to use the katana. As a genin I only used kunai you see, and I'd love to be able to tell my father that I got some instruction off the yellow flash. He says you're one of the best katana users he's ever seen. Oh, of course. Minato grinned with relief. I'd be happy to help. Do you have a training sword yet? No. Then let's sort that out. See, any old stick won't do. The most important thing is to get a weapon that's comfortable to use. Some people think that bigger is better, but you've got to remember that a weapon is an extension of your body. If it isn't perfectly balanced for you personally, you might as well be wearing shoes that are too big or gloves with too few fingers. The Hyuga girl hung on to his every word. Yes. He showed her to the store cupboard where the wooden training katana were stored, took one look at her and offered her one of the shorter, slimmer blades. We'll see how you get on with that one, he said. It's a bit small, she said uncertainly. So is mine. Don't tell anyone. She giggled shyly and followed him to one of the free mats at the center of the hall, where he proceeded to put up his guard and invited her to take strikes at him. It usually wasn't wise to let a novice take swings at anything but a dummy stuffed with sand, but Minato was pretty confident in his ability to deflect any lucky hits she might make, and it wasn't the first time he'd been approached for advice. This way he could feel the weight and speed of her strikes for himself and advise her posture from close quarters. And people always seemed to pick things up faster when presented with the opportunity to smack him around the head. It seemed to be the aspiration for a lot of newbies. And this girl was no exception to the Hyuga legacy. She may have been exploiting her eyes a little, but even so, after half an hour of teaching her the basic stance, swing and parry moves, he doubted she would be a novice for very long. You should probably try sparring with someone closer to your own level, he told her. You think I'm ready? She whispered. Sure. There's nothing that motivates people better than getting their first few hits in, so. He scanned the room. Pick on Yamanaka Inoichi. He's got a tough skull. In his brief scan he also noticed someone else standing at the edge of the room, staring at him. The Hyuga girl noticed too. Isn't that Hatake Tsukumo? She asked cautiously. Yes, he said. Does he always stare at you like that? Oh, yes. He sighed and turned back to her. Tell Inoichi I sent you, and he'll play nice, I promise. She nodded nervously and bowed with a soft, heartfelt thank you before hurrying away. Minato swiped at the sweat beading on his brow and crossed the training hall to where Tsukumo appeared to be waiting for him. It was unusual for him to seek Minato out like this. There had to be something up. Like, maybe he'd finally figured out that his precious student was involved and had come to deliver some honest threats of dismemberment should he ever hurt her. Oh, well. If things got ugly, Minato could probably outrun him. Sakumo sensei. He acknowledged the jonin with a polite nod, checking for the subtle lines of tension that could warn him of any impending murder attempt. Minato sensei, Sakumo responded dryly. Minato cast a sheepish look back at his student. Yeah, well, I get ambushed, it's hard to say no. Does it bother you? Sakumo asked. People asking for help? No, he said quickly. It's better than training alone, or standing back and watching them struggle without offering to help. Sakumo stroked his chin. Now, is that how you really feel or what you think I want to hear? Why should I care about what you want to hear? Minato said, largely because he knew that was exactly the kind of thing Hatake Sakumo wanted to hear. The older jonin sighed. Talking to you is like digging in sand. Every time you think you get somewhere, more sand just pours in over what you've uncovered and you're no deeper than before. I think he just called you shallow, Minato told himself, though he wasn't sure. Thank you, he said humbly, pretending it was a compliment. But I ask because the Hokage has tasked me with a new mission, said Sakumo. I thought you'd be interested. Well, considering how our last mission turned out, do you think that's wise? Minato wondered, moving to one of the benches to pick up a towel and his discarded jacket. We wouldn't be working together, Sakumo told him. That's all I needed to hear. Sign me up right away. Minato flashed him a cheeky smile and noticed how Sakumo's eyes rolled faintly upwards. You're getting to be more like Kushina all the time. I was hoping she would be a good influence, but typically you're only acquiring her mischievous side. Are you interested or not? I suppose it depends on what it is you're offering. There's an opening for a commander at the main outpost near the Kumo border. The last commander met with some unpleasantness, and with tensions escalating, the Hokage wants to send a man out there not just to train the chunin but to keep them safe and defuse problems before they start. The Kumo Nin have started accusing us of kidnapping some of their people and they're itching for a fight. I think you have what the outpost needs, and I think you'll benefit from the experience. Minato chewed his cheek thoughtfully. This isn't a short-term mission, is it? It's a job, Sakumo agreed. You're moving up from jonin to commanding one of our most vital outposts. It's as good as a promotion. What about mentoring Kakashi? Kakashi can wait. He may be a genin, but he still has many years to go before he completes his academy education. He really should be leaping at the chance, and for a moment he couldn't understand why he wasn't. Then he remembered. I don't want to leave Kushina. While he meditated on this, he was deaf to the sounds of sparring behind him, including the disbelieving curses of one Yamanaka Inoichi. As a chunin novice several years his junior, jabbed him repeatedly in soft places. Sakumo folded his arms and drummed his fingers with mild impatience. I could have offered this to anyone and they would have hugged me by now in tears of joy. Sakumo didn't really want him to do that, did he? Pushing back his sentimentality over Kushina, he tried to come up with a more rational excuse. I might be too young. A lot of chunin are older than I am and have more experience out there, it could compromise my authority. How do you get experience without putting yourself out there? Sakumo responded. I wouldn't be asking you if I didn't think you were the best suited. I'm honored, but I'll have to think about it. Minato said with finality. He wouldn't commit himself to anything just yet before speaking to Kushina. If you want me to cry and hug you, though, I'll be more than happy to. That's all the sand I care to dig through today, thank you, Sakumo interrupted, and started as if to leave before suddenly stopping and turning back to him, stepping closer than Minato thought was polite or appropriate. One more thing. Yes? Minato asked uncertainly. If you hurt her, Sakumo said, each word dropping with an icy clang. I will make your life so utterly unbearable that you would rather move away and become a pig farmer than remain a shinobi in my village. Is that understood? Oh dear God, he knew. Yes, sir, Minato said, ashamed of the squeak that crept into his voice. And just so you know, these aren't empty threats. Did you know that yellow flash is a popular euphemism for urination? And no. Is it? No. But it would become one, if you cross her. Did the man have no depths to which he would not sink? Minato gathered himself together admirably. I would never hurt Kushina. Intentionally. Sir. I would hope not. Get back to me with your decision soon. The Hokage wants to fill the position by the end of the week at the latest. With that, Tsukumo turned smoothly and left the training hall. All Minato could hear was his blood pounding in his ears, almost drowning out Inoichi's yelps in the background. Why was he suddenly getting the same feeling he had when Danzu had tried to send him off on a suicide mission? Tsukumo probably didn't want him dead, but was it really a coincidence that the same time he'd learned of Minato's relationship with his student, he suddenly found a wonderful position for Minato on the other side of the country? Even if that was the ulterior motive, Minato couldn't deny that the opportunity was a truly tempting one. A couple of years ago, when he'd been restless and ill at ease in the village, he would have been jumping for joy at the chance to go back into the thick of it at the border, and he may very well have been crying and hugging Tsukumo for the offer. Now he had Kushina, and that appeared to be the only reason he had to be reluctant. Was that wise? Normally he would be the first to say putting your relationship before your career was a bad idea, but that was back when he'd been thinking of Kushina's relationship to Run. His own was a different matter. There had to be a compromise. It would be awesome if she came with me. He needed to talk it over with her, so he resolved to head right back home after his shower. She'd gotten back from her mission last night, and while Minato always liked to hit the training yard after his assignments, Kushina always spent the day after a mission loafing about the house like a lazy ferret, nibbling her way through all the snacks in the kitchen until she'd restored her sugar levels enough to consider taking on the next mission. He always thought she should train more than she did, but she never appeared to suffer for it. She was the kind of person who could eat nothing but rubbish and still remain as fit as ever. Minato, however, had to watch himself. Now that Kushina had figured out how much he liked her cooking, she was doing it more often, which was either an attempt to please him or fatten him up for Christmas. Trips to the training hall had stopped being about blowing off steam and more about necessity. He didn't think the Kyumo border outpost would take too kindly to his command if he had to be rolled in through the gates. Kushina? You home? He called when he arrived. When no one responded, he mooched into the kitchen, his stomach already grumbling at the thought of food. A packet of instant ramen waited for him on the table. It may not have been as good as the ramen Kushina made from scratch, but it would fill a hole. While he boiled the kettle, he continued to shout into the house. What you been up to? You should really come to the training hall with me sometimes. I think you'd like it. All that sweating, and grunting, and bodily contact. He heard her footsteps thundering down the stairs like a small elephant, and turned, ready to catch her as she happily fell into his arms crying, "My darling," or something. Instead, Kushina swooped right past him and dumped a mound of books onto the kitchen table so suddenly the legs wobbled precariously. When she turned and faced him, her expression told him there would be no canoodling today. What's that? He asked, looking apprehensively at the books. I was hoping you could tell me, she retorted sharply. He didn't need to look too closely to see what titles they were. Whirlpool, Rise and Fall of a Nation, and The Fathers of Whirlpool or Eddies in Time, History of the Whirlpool Village. She'd evidently found his research project. You went through my room? He asked accusingly. We're ninja. You go through my room all the time, so don't avoid the question, she said. What is this about? I was curious about Whirlpool. He shrugged at her, hoping that sounded reasonable enough. It was mostly true anyway. She wasn't falling for it, judging by the way her eyes narrowed on him. Really? Anything in particular that stoked your curiosity? She picked one of the books open and rather treacherously it fell open on one of the dog-eared pages he'd marked out. A black and white picture of the third leader of Whirlpool stared back at him like an older and milder male version of Kushina. The resemblance was quite uncanny when they were next to each other like that, or it would be if she didn't look quite so angry. "What's the problem?" he asked evasively. "This is all in the public domain. People check these books out all the time. How come you get mad when I read them?" "Because this is my father," she barked. "If you had questions, why wouldn't you ask me instead of running to some dry old books written by people who weren't even there?" She couldn't have spent the last few days studiously ignoring all his attempts, subtle and unsubtle, to learn about what had happened to her, and then genuinely wonder why he hadn't bothered asking her this. With a forced sigh he gasped, "Fine." And since he already knew pretty much all there was to know about her father by now, there was only one question left he wanted an answer to. "Why do you hate your father?" Kushina went white. "My father was a great man." "That's not what those books say," he pointed out. "And look who's avoiding the question now. Those books don't know anything, that's why you shouldn't be reading such garbage. They all seem to agree that he was the one who led the village to ruin. Yes, they all agree, but it's only thanks to him that they're alive to complain. The whole village would have been wiped out in the disaster that killed the second if not for my father, and they all have the nerve to whine because he couldn't save them from themselves." "Then if you're so proud of him," argued Minato, "why do you never talk about him?" "Why do you never talk about your parents?" she shot back. "I don't know my parents. I learned everything I know about my mother from a bingo book, and if I ever figure out who my father is or where I can find him, I'll tell you about him sometime. But this isn't about me. You told me your father destroyed everything, and if it wasn't the village he destroyed, what was it?" "You must have misheard me," she said quietly. "It has something to do with you, doesn't it?" Kushina said nothing. The kettle clicked off and rattled with the pressure of boiling water, but neither of them attended. Minato moved through the steam and took her hand to steer into one of the kitchen chairs. She didn't put up a fight, but she certainly refused to look at him. "You left the village and the Hokage declared a state of emergency, blaming it on your condition. I've been wondering ever since what the hell kind of condition could scare the most powerful man in the country to such an action, and I think I've been pretty patient. But you can't honestly expect me forget about it." "Why can't you?" she asked, a little petulantly. The grumpy, muddy child she'd been was starting to peek through. "You forget loads of things. You always forget to feed the bloody habanero." "The bloody what?" he repeated faintly. "The guinea pig. See, you even forgot her name." He sighed in contrition. "Guinea pigs aside," he said, soldiering on bravely, "I was hoping that you would at least trust me enough to tell me the truth." "It's not a big deal," she protested quietly. "The Hokage overreacted. If that's the case, just tell me. Will you stop worrying about it if I do?" There was something to be said for the virtue of pestering. Minato could see the thick icy wall she'd constructed around herself since disappearing off to Whirlpool showed its first crack with her last plea. Days of carefully navigated silence began to fall away and Kushina suddenly looked more tired than he'd ever seen her, especially when he nodded his enthusiastic agreement to her terms. For a second she looked ready to retreat again, shaking her head as if brushing off a momentary lapse of weakness. Then just as quickly, she caved. Once more. "You know how my village was mostly eminent for our sealing techniques? Well, there isn't a continent or a country or a city, town, or village that could equal us. So when I say that my father had the best sealing techniques in the village, you know it actually means he had the best in the world. He was like you, I guess. A completely insufferable genius." She couldn't have minded insufferable geniuses too much or they wouldn't be holding hands right now. Minato smiled and remained quiet. He didn't dare interrupt her. "I guess if those sealing techniques fell into the wrong hands, it would be a disaster. That was partly what the war was over, you know. My father's sealing techniques saved the village from a disaster that would have sunk the island into the sea, and once they saw that power, the reformists wanted it. Or more likely they were scared of it. The village tore itself apart because of what my father had, so why wouldn't the Hokage fear the same thing happening here? But why would it happen here? Minato prompted. Your father died a long time ago, right? I've never heard anything about such powerful techniques, so I doubt they survived. Kushina took a deep breath. They survive as long as I survive, she said, and her fingers began to fumble with the fastener of her blue tunic, popping the buttons open one by one. This had to be some kind of distraction technique, because this really wasn't the time or place to take this step in their relationship. Minato nearly tried to stop her, but some very neglected voice of his masculinity told him to wait and see where she was going with this. The tunic slipped down the back of the seat, and her long-sleeved black shirt followed, leaving her in only her sports bra, which was truly earning its every stitch for how hard it worked in compressing Kushina's infamously bountiful assets that had once inspired so much bullying. Do you see now? She asked him. Yes. He smiled. Kushina snapped her fingers in front of his face, breaking his line of sight with her breasts. Pay attention, Minato. Dragging his gaze away, he finally noticed what it was that had prompted her to remove her top, what she was trying to show him. Now he wondered how he could have missed it, even for a second. On her stomach were the markings of what could only be a seal. The spiral could only be whirlpool in origin, but even though it was foreign to him, he could see how incredibly complex and intricate it was. Each marked-out character, and there had to be about 8, was layer upon layer of protection, representing the fortitude of each element. Minato had never seen anything like it. Literally. As he reached out to brush his fingers across her marked skin, he said, I've definitely seen your stomach before, but I've never seen that before. She jumped a little at his touch as if ticklish. It only appears if I let my chakra interact with it. I can't believe it. I thought you were joking when you said you could seal things in people. He got down on his knees and held her waist as he examined her closely. Professional admiration for such quality sealing work had taken over, but only now did Kushina start to blush as he stared intently at her. What's behind the seal? She took a moment to answer, and when she did her voice was oddly flat. I told you, my father's work. All his knowledge. He leaned back to look her in the eye. If this seal was an example of his work, Minato could understand how it might be so highly sought after. Even he was a little tempted to get his hands on it. Can you release it? He asked. No, she said shortly. Nor can anyone else, so don't bother asking. Puzzling, he thought, watching her jam her clothes back on as the seal faded. Why would a man go to such pains to seal his techniques into his daughter, presumably for posterity, and leave no means for her or anyone else to recover them? If his knowledge would die with her, what was the point in sealing the knowledge to begin with? Unless he hadn't planned on dying and he had been using her crassly as some kind of safety deposit box with legs that he could open later at his leisure. But what if this was his legacy to his daughter, and somehow somewhere he really had intended her to have the means to open this seal one day? Maybe he left you some kind of key and you don't even realize it, he suggested. It doesn't make sense to seal the techniques in you if he intended for them to perish, you don't understand. This seal can't be broken and it shouldn't ever be. Kushina's voice cracked with a sudden flare of emotion. I'm no one's legacy, I'm just a freak. If this seal was undone, there's no telling how many people would be hurt and killed, and I'd be responsible. You're not a freak, he said firmly. It would take a lot more than a funny seal to convince me otherwise. She didn't look too consoled by the thought. You can't tell anyone about this. Minato mimed, zipping his lips shut. Though I don't know why you thought this would change the way I feel about you. And did Ren really freak out over some dead techniques being locked inside his girlfriend? Aside from the slight cosmetic issue, it wasn't anything that could have tangentially interfered in their relationship. Even if Ren's loss was Minato's gain, he struggled to believe someone as mature and mannered as the Hokage's nephew would have had such trouble coming to terms with something as trivial as this. Kushina was almost shaky with relief as she reached out and hugged him. It was obvious she had been incredibly worried about his reaction, and though plenty still didn't add up, and he wondered if there was something else she was holding back from him, he didn't have the heart to keep interrogating her. He'd learned more than he'd expected to, and for now that was enough. Later, he could check out a few books on Whirlpool's sealing techniques. Pulling back until only her hands remained resting on his shoulders, Kushina smiled at him. "I forget how great you are sometimes," she confided. "I'm really going to miss you when you go." Minato frowned. "Go where?" She looked equally confused. "Haven't you seen Sensei today? He said there was a commanding position at an outpost that he was going to offer you." "Oh," he said. "That. Also, I think he kind of figured out that we were together." "Really?" Minato exclaimed softly. "He didn't let on at all. So what do you think of the position? It seems perfect for you." She seemed much too pleased at the thought of them separating indefinitely. "It's very far away," he said uncertainly. "Maybe, but Sensei says the climate is quite nice over there." Blatant lies. The mountainous border was freezing and the air was thin. If you tripped and fell into a chasm, that would be the last anyone saw of you, and that was if you didn't drop dead from the altitudes. No wonder Tsukumo was so keen for him to go. "No," he said to Kushina, "I mean, we won't be able to see each other as much." "True, but you don't seem that upset." "Of course not," she ground out. "I'm trying to be happy for you because this is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of opportunity, and I don't want to be the kind of girl who holds her guy back from his dreams because she's too needy." "My dreams?" he echoed, astonished. "You're going to be Hokage one day, aren't you?" she reminded, smiling gently. "You told me that you would help me with my dreams by rebuilding my village brick by brick if I asked, so here I am, helping you with yours. Go to the outpost, Minato. Prove to everyone that you can be a leader." This was honestly not what he'd been expecting. Her support may have been steely, but her smile was a little too fake. Maybe she was just as reluctant to see him leave the village so soon as he was, though she was doing a better job of mastering her emotions. A heavy feeling came over his heart, like a real physical force threatening to drag his spirit down through the floor. "Can't you come with me?" he asked, pleaded really. "I have my own missions," she reminded. "Besides," she added, with false airiness, "it'll be nice to have the house to myself for a change." Minato was mortified. This job was threatening to take him away from the one and only person he had ever loved, and she wasn't going to stop him. The blissful days they'd spent together, laughing and kissing and holding each other on the sofa when they watched zombie movies, was going to end. Surely this was too soon for their fragile fledgling of a relationship. They hadn't even made out properly yet. "I'll go see Sakimo Sensei tomorrow," he said, like a man speaking of making his appointment with the gallows. "You're right. It's stupid to let the opportunity slip by just because it'll doom me to loneliness and despair." Kushina giggled. She must have thought he was joking. "We'll still see each other when you get leave," she told him, running her hands affectionately through his hair. "And we'll write." "You're planning on replacing me, aren't you?" he guessed glumly. "And you'll turn my room into a great big guinea pig hutch." "I'm more likely to turn it into your shrine," she rebuked. When that failed to cheer him up, she kissed his cheek. "Don't be sad." Which was far easier to say than obey. It was an opportunity that he would have been mad to pass up, and Kushina was forceful in her support. She had decided not to stand in the way of his success, and she took this to the point of pushing him out the door. Plus, she said, the position was a limited-time offer, whereas she would always be there for as long as he wanted or needed her. That still didn't make his departure any easier. After informing Tsukumo that he would be happy to accept the position, he was scheduled to leave in the company of 2 guides who knew the way to the remote outpost hidden in the mountains. Their wisdom and directional sense was beyond reproach, except for the one whose name was Yamanaka Inoichi. The trip would take a few days, or so they told him, and on the morning he was due to leave he made sure to pack all his supplies. All the necessary stuff was there: the water flask, the dried food rations, the weapons, the scrolls, and the double-lined thermal vest for those cold mountain nights. The one thing he didn't have and couldn't find, and needed so urgently that when he realized its absence he began to tear his room apart to find it, was the silly little whirlpool charm that Kushina had given him more than 5 years ago. "Where is it?" he demanded of no one specifically as he threw his socks across the room to get to the bottom of his drawers. "I know I had it here somewhere. How could I have lost it? I never lose it." "Lost what?" "Your marbles?" Kushina asked, poking her head through his bedroom door. Frantic searching and packing before a mission was usually her area, so she was enjoying the rare sight of him imitating a headless chicken. But he couldn't tell her what he was looking for. He knew for sure that she'd either laugh at him or roll her eyes and tell him to get over the little plastic medallion that had long since seen better days. She probably wouldn't remember making it or giving it to him anyway. So, with time growing short, he reluctantly abandoned his search. Minato wasn't a superstitious man, but he was quite certain that this did not bode well for his assignment. After losing Kushina's charm it could only go downhill from there. Word got out that the yellow flash was leaving, naturally. What he thought would be a quiet send-off at the gates between himself and Kushina turned into more of a spectacle than he'd anticipated. Jiraiya was there, of course, waiting to clap him on the shoulder and remind him to stay on his toes, and if he was ever in doubt about what to do he should think what your old sensei would do and you will obtain perfection. With a pang in his chest, Minato realized the last time he'd left the village, it was his separation from his sensei that had cut him the most. Now, he realized, his old dependency had ended. He wasn't a child anymore, though he'd still miss him as an adult. His old teammates were there too. Saburo nodded to him in grave silence, whereas Ai winked and enveloped him in a hug that went on a little too long to be polite. Which was most likely her intention. If Kushina's carefully maintained smile disappeared at that point, only Minato and her sensei noticed, the latter of whom patted her back consolingly. Shikaku and Chuza may have been there to see their own teammate off, but they were part of the crowd wishing him well along with some of his regular subordinates and casual acquaintances, and the Hyuga girl who he'd only met once. Dimly he wondered if they'd been misinformed that this was some kind of party going on by the gates. He found it hard to fathom that all those people were there just to see him off. He understood his popularity sometimes. Other times, he really didn't. "We should get going before it gets dark," reminded Inoichi, who was just as baffled as Minato. Pulling away from the group of Chunin girls who tended to follow him around the village, though he hadn't figured this out yet, and wasn't always the same group every time, he found himself face to face with Kushina again. "Before you go," she said, more nervously than he was used to, "I thought you might like this." From the pouch on her hip she drew her gift and pressed it into his hand so it was for his eyes only. Minato recognized it once, even though the broken leather thong had been replaced by a more durable nylon loop with a proper fastener. The little plastic disc was the same, scratched up to hell, but the glue that formed the whirlpool symbol was as good as indestructible. "When," he muttered, unable to articulate more than that. "Sorry I went through your room to get it," she said. "But I figured it needed an upgrade. I hope you don't mind." Minato stared at her, lost for words. There had to be some arrangement in his vocabulary that would accurately convey just how astonished, grateful and damn happy he was at her gesture, but language escaped him. All he could give her was a wobbly smile. "Good God!" Inoichi moaned. "Either kiss her or get moving." That was actually a very good idea. So regardless of the promise he'd made to Kushina, and that there was a swarm of witnesses nearby, and that he was condemning her to be hated and detested by most of his present stalkers, as well as submitting himself to the murderous glare of Hitaki Tsukumo, Minato stepped forward, wrapped his arms around her, and kissed her like it would be their last. It was hard to say who was more shocked, the crowd or Kushina. Kushina at least recovered first, perhaps agreeing that it was time to break their silence at last as her stiffness faded and she held him close to her just as earnestly. He might have heard an appreciative, nice, from his sensei and a more dismayed, damn, from Inoichi. He didn't really care what anyone else thought, or how many of them were plotting her death. He knew what the village thought of this upstart, loud-mouthed redhead, and knew many of the gazes leveled at them would be disapproving, but none of them could now deny that he loved her. For many it was merely confirmation of a very old suspicion. Embracing her had not made it easier to part ways. He broke the kiss to squeeze her tight, kissing her cheek once, then twice, as he whispered the fervent promise that he would be back at the first opportunity. When he eased away from her he still found himself astonished at the expression on her face, to see everything he felt mirrored back at him like he was looking at the other half of himself. To love and be loved. It didn't just make him feel alive, it made him immortal. "I'll see you soon," he told her. "I know." She nodded and smiled. "Take care." It would be over 2 years before he came home again. Although it was only 3 weeks before his first of many opportunities for leave. June 25th. Dear Kushina, thank you for the package of ashizushi. A few even survived the handling of my subordinates to get to me. I'll be lining them up later to check for sticky fingers and punishing accordingly. Any suggestions? How are things? Not much has changed here. Apparently it's summer, but you couldn't say for sure. The roof of my cabin is still leaking snow in, though one of the new recruits offered to fix it by lying across the gap in the roof at night. Not sure he was joking. My next leave is in 4 weeks, from the 29th to the 3rd, want to do anything special? Love, Minato. June 28th. Minato, you're always complaining about the cold, so I'm enclosing a scarf for you. Since it's summer you might as well have one of mine while I'm not using it. And don't punish your guys too harshly. From how you describe the food up there, I don't blame them for filching yours. Commanders should share with their less fortunate subordinates, right? Things are okay here. I gave the bloody habanero back to Yoshi because I think she's been too lonely without the yellow flasher. I'd have given her to Kakashi, but Sakumo-sensei eyes down on pets. He keeps going on about Kakashi's allergies. Fair point. That kid does wheeze a lot around animals. Everything else is fine. I had a mission with Ren and it's still really awkward. I was hoping we could still be friends, but it's harder than I thought. But so far so good, no death threats. Your friend AI has started to ignore me completely these days, so that's an improvement at least. If you can manage it, can you be back on the 27th? That's when the big summer festival is being held. You can win me some goldfish to replace habanero and the flasher. Lots of love, Kushina XXX. July 1st. Dear Kushina, thank you for the scarf. It smells like you and I've received many compliments about how well it matches my eyes. Herein I enclose a token of my own affection. Might be able to make the 27th, depends on when my temp substitute gets here. I'll get back to you on that. Love, hugs and kisses, Minato. P.S. No goldfish for you. I was banned from those stalls when I was 10 of account of cleaning them out too many times. July 3rd. Minato, please stop sending me your underwear. Love, Kushina. July 4th. Dearest Kushina, send me a pair of yours and then we'll be even. If not, please return the pair I sent you. It's been draftier than I thought it would be without them. Signed, Minato. P.S. I saw this flower and it made me think of you. Enjoy. July 8th. Minato, find pants enclosed. Thank you for the pressed snowdrop, but what about it reminded you of me? Hugs and kisses, Kushina. July 11th. Dear Kushina, I saw the snowdrop and thought about sending it to you, that's all really. There's no other flowers up here. In retrospect, there's no reason it should have reminded me of you. It's white, you're red. It smells like a crushed weed, you smell like roses. Also, it's a plant and you're a person. I guess you both like cold weather though. Temp Sub says he can make 27th. I can be there for the festival. If I go in disguise, maybe I can win you some fish after all. Love, Minato. P.S. These are not the pants I originally sent you. I don't wear briefs. July 15th. Minato, I'm looking forward to seeing you again. I was worried I'd have to end up going alone. Mikoto and Fugueface invited me to go with them, but as a couple they just make me gag. I'd rather be with you making other people gag. And maybe we can go out for dinner sometime? Seems like something proper couples do too. Although TBH, just having you around is good enough. I miss hanging out with you. Sometimes I just really miss your arms. Love, Kushina. P.S. Of course they're not your pants. They're mine. July 17th. Dear Jiraiya Sensei, is it normal for girls to wear briefs? Just wondering. Sincerely, Minato. P.S. Receiving presents off emissaries from Kumo Outpost. Is that normal too? July 19th. Minato, my dear boy, ask not what is normal where Uzumaki Kushina is concerned. I have it under good authority that she gave one of her squad leaders a flea in the ear over his treatment of an informant and was suspended for 3 weeks without pay for insubordination. Sakumo is practically gloating with pride over it. Nothing she does surprises me anymore. Although feel free to tell me more. Receiving presents from the enemy is odd. I'm guessing the emissary is either female or that way inclined. Jiraiya X. July 23rd. Minato, do you have anything to wear to the festival? I can get you a yukata, if you pay me back later. Something in lavender? You're still the same size, right? Still totally stoked you're coming. Can't wait to see you on Saturday. Loads of love, Kushina. July 26th. Minato, I've not heard back from you about the yukata. I got you one. Anyway. Your substitute should have turned up by now. Are you still coming? Kushina. July 26th. Dear Sir/Madam, it is my painful duty to inform you that a report has this day been received from Administration Office that CMD, Namikaze Minato became missing in action on July 22nd. Should any information be received, it will be communicated in due course to the next Ofkin. I am to express the sympathy of the Council with the Shinobi's relatives in their anxiety. Humbly yours, Soma Naota, Records Office. July 27th. Dear Soma, that's a fine excuse. When he turns up, tell him he still owes me for a yukata and a ruined date. Uzumaki Kushina. July 22nd. Minato leant back in his chair and stretched his cramped arms above his head, straightening out the crinkles in his spine that had accumulated after 2 hours of keeping up with his correspondence. If it wasn't the administration office demanding daily updates about what was going on, to which Minato could only reply, still nothing, it was the commander from the undermanned Mist Border Outpost demanding Minato send some chunin his way like they were some sort of chattel. This was the man who had been appointed by Danzu after the last war, and Minato was inclined to keep gently rebutting his letters, deferring to the will of his chunin and the wisdom of the administration office in deciding where to concentrate their forces. He usually got some pretty scathing responses alluding to his age, appearance, and how far his balls had dropped yet. Minato pinned these to the wall behind him in pride of place next to the letters and pictures Kushina regularly sent. In 2 years, this was the only personalization he'd made to his cabin when he'd inherited it off the former commander. There were some rugs nailed to the walls to insulate the room against the cold, but those had been there when Minato arrived. It wasn't that his tastes were Spartan, but after surviving 3 years on the mist front looking on at a commander who surrounded himself with opulent furnishings and exotic artifacts of home, Minato found that kind of excessive abuse of privileges lewd when every man beneath him was sleeping 10 to a room with as much space for personal touches as the wall beside their bunk would allow. Nor did he grant his jonin much favors beyond what would normally be granted. In a base of some 100 chunin, there were only 3 of jonin rank, including himself. Yuhi, of the strange red eyes, was one of the others, 15 years his senior but thankfully not bitter about serving under a younger commander. Gecko, the third, was 1 year Minato's junior and only recently promoted, a possible hypochondriac, or else extremely unlucky to be the one person on the base with chronic altitude sickness. Gecko was the first to come to his cabin that morning, carrying a scroll that must have been delivered by bird a few minutes beforehand. She looked gray and sickly. To say she resembled a zombie would have been flattering. "How's it going, Gecko?" Minato asked, accepting the newest scroll. "Oh, well, not bad," she sighed. "The ringing in the ears isn't quite as loud anymore, but the insomnia's pretty bad. Haven't slept in 3 days. Or 4. I can't remember." "Great," Minato murmured, not really listening. "While you're here, can you take these to Yuhi? He's taking Eagle Group for reconnaissance down in the Vale." Gecko sniffed. "But Kumo hold that ground. Illegally. I want to see how happy the locals are about it." Minato gave her a measured look. "Why don't you go with them? You might benefit from the lower altitude." "Oh, that would be nice," she said wistfully and shuffled out. Almost immediately she shuffled back in again. "I think I see the emissary from the Kumo outpost is here again." He scratched the back of his head thoughtfully. "Twice in a week. That's a record." Then he straightened and began to put the documents with sensitive information out of sight. "Send her in." The emissary was the second in command of the Kumo outpost on the other side of the border. Aside from a tiny goat-herding village some miles to the south, it was the only other sign of civilization on these mountains. The friction that sparked between Konoha and Kumo along the rest of the border cooled here, as the petty political squabbles at the heart of the countries didn't have much impact in the mountains. The outpost on the Kumo border were the closest thing the Konoha outpost had to neighbors, in the sense they were both naturally suspicious of one another and frequently poked their noses over the proverbial fence into each other's business. But up front the two bases interacted freely. In fact, on her last visit the emissary had brought him Kumo-tailored gloves after he'd complained about the cold to her a few weeks ago. And while Kumo was known for its inferior weapon design and shoddy military tactics, no one could complain that they didn't know how to make a decent pair of gloves. A tall black woman entered and fixed her amber eyes on Minato in a way that reminded him far too much of AI, almost friendly, but mostly condescending. Her smile said she liked what she saw but she would only be too happy to twist a knife in his back if he turned around long enough. "I hope you're keeping well," said the emissary as she and her personal guard came forward. Meetings were never conducted alone. Gecko took her place to the left of Minato's chair while the emissary's guard took a similar position, and they proceeded to eye each other belligerently. "And keeping warm of course," she added. "Thanks to you, Kei-san." Minato gestured for her to sit. "Well, I was just beginning to get used to you so it would be a shame if you went down with pneumonia. Although I hear you'll be leaving us soon anyway." "That's a pity." How did they find these things out, he wondered. Knowing full well she was simply demonstrating the power of her intelligence division, he chose not to react. It wasn't exactly top-secret material to begin with. "Yes, I'll be returning to Konoha permanently in a few months. Then you'll have to break in a new commander, I'm afraid." "Pity," she repeated, smiling like pity was furthest from her mind. "I suppose your Hokage wants to keep someone like you close to the action, and God knows there's certainly none out here. Although if you like I can tell my commander to launch an all-out assault against your outpost." Maybe then your boss will think twice about sending you away. You're so kind to offer, he said. But I'm actually quite happy to be retired early. You can have too much fresh air. You must have a sweetheart at home, she deduced. What else could drag you away from this riveting frontline of defense? What else? He agreed. You lasted longer than your predecessor, Kei-san noted. I never liked that guy. Jumpy. Rude. Always blaming us for every avalanche and rockslide or whatever else that went wrong. I wasn't impressed when they said he'd been replaced by a 19-year-old boy whose hairs hadn't even grown in yet, but I stand corrected. You've been a surprisingly enjoyable adversary. Minato smiled slightly. I don't think you came here to pay me compliments, he said, although they're very welcome. Well, no, she snorted. I don't take trips across the treacherous chasms just to pop in for tea and biscuits. And since you asked, yes, I would love a cup of tea. The last she said to Gekko. His subordinate had always resented the hell out of being told to fetch tea, and after a stiff pause she turned and went to the cupboard where the basic tea makings were kept for Minato's own personal use, and since Minato preferred soda to tea, they were rather dusty. As she poured the boiling water, she made sure to issue a few phlegmy coughs before handing it to Kei-san, who took it graciously. Only after her first sip, and a grimace over its weak flavor, did she proceed on to business. Kumo wishes to meet with you, Minato-kun, she said simply, blowing on the steam. As soon as possible at that. A very important man has come all the way from Kumo to speak to you. Which begged the question, why? The emissary shrugged emphatically. Why should I know? Me, a mere vice-commander of an outpost of little strategic value, am not privy to the whims of the Kumo elite. Although I imagine it has something to do with the fact your Hokage refuses to answer to the allegations of kidnap. You have a reputation for being reasonable rather than pig-headed, and you obviously have the ear of your leader. It's not so unusual that Kumo would attempt to correspond through you. Which would be a slap in the face to the Hokage, if that's the case, he observed. So that would seem counterproductive on your end. Minato-kun, come on, she said, giving him a look that was supposed to inspire trust but in fact did the opposite. You know how desperate the head boys are getting over this abduction. Business. We've lost 30 people, 9 of them newborn babies snatched from their very cradles, and all evidence points to Konoha. We're not the only ones either. Our intelligence division reports abductions from at least 2 other villages who are also pointing the finger at Konoha. It is every shinobi's duty to defend their village, but don't you think your leaders go too far? This is slander. Gekko exploded. Lies and propaganda from the village that's been kidnapping children of other clans for decades. Gekko, Minato cautioned mildly, and with an angry cough she pressed her lips together valiantly. Unruffled, Kei-san spread her hands innocently. Kumo may have taken a little morsel from time to time. We rescue them from poverty and miserable fates, treat them well, and they are welcomed into our village as one of us. She said. It would have been a lovely tale, if true. One of the initial catalysts of the Second World War was the abduction of a couple of perfectly happy children from their powerful families, but who knew what the Kumo village leaders told their people? Never have I heard of such widespread indiscriminate body snatching. We know the people being taken are taken to be slaughtered, butchered, and their secrets stolen, so don't act like there is a moral equivalency here. Your village is committing crimes against humanity and the world will not stand for it much longer. Gekko gasped, raring to give an angry retort, but while Minato remained blankly calm in the face of such accusations she had to hold herself still. You say newborns are taken? He asked. And there is evidence they're being taken for experimentation? Kei-san folded her arms triumphantly. See, you do know things about it. I'm tired of Konoha feigning ignorance. Because the same thing was happening in Konoha a few years ago. Minato lapsed into a thoughtful silence. The Hokage was maintaining a wall of silence on the matter, hiding the fact that such an incredible breach in safety and security had been allowed to continue for so long. But if there was a possibility that the other villages were moving to unite against Konoha under the mistaken belief that his village was responsible, how could they maintain that silence out of pride? While the Hokage's inferred orders were of utmost secrecy, as a commander a few things were up to his discretion. Defusing the start of the Third World War was one of them. Your leaders turned on your own people too? Kei-san asked suspiciously. I doubt Konoha's leaders are responsible, Minato said evenly. He thought of the Hokage, who would rather go to painful lengths to shoo a bumblebee out of his window than swat it dead, and couldn't see him sanctioning such a needlessly cruel experiment on his own people. Even the darker figures behind the seat of power, like Danzu, weren't really capable of such things. Danzu obviously wasn't above discreetly trying to get rid of those in his way, but he was the shadiest character in Konoha's regime, and he would probably be the first in line to be outraged about Konoha's people being abducted and killed. I've never heard any of this before, Gekko said quietly, with a subtle hint in her tone that this was sensitive information that if she should not be hearing, the emissary from Kyumo definitely shouldn't be hearing it either. Konoha conducted an investigation into it some years ago, he explained, leaving out his own involvement. It was found to most likely be the work of one rogue figure, or a very small group. The investigation was concluded with the death of the main suspect, and as far as I know, there have been no further cases of abduction in Konoha. That's very interesting, but it seems your investigation was flawed, said Kei-san. If this is the same culprit, he has merely moved on to collecting people from other villages to avoid alerting your authorities again. In which case we still have a problem. Your village is harboring a mass murderer targeting other villages, and you have done nothing to stop him. You are abetting him. Harsh, Minato frowned. But I suppose the anger is understandable. The people at the top always brush off such incredible allegations as saber-rattling prior to the war. Perhaps it needs to be looked into. So you will meet with our captain? Kei-san demanded. He laughed. No. She shot him an annoyed look, like she was wishing to take back all the compliments on his maturity. You're just a frightened little boy, after all. Maybe, but I'm not mad, he said. Let me guess, meeting him would require walking into your base defenseless. Come now, she said coyly. We have rules and conventions about treating visiting representatives of other villages with care and respect. And we're ninja, honor-bound to break the rules we make whenever it's to our advantage, he pointed out. Yet I come here all the time, putting my life in your hands. No, your commander is putting your life in our hands. You're expendable, he told her bluntly. He may be willing to take that risk with his subordinates, but I won't place myself or anyone in my care in such a risky situation. Says you, who allegedly walked into a primary mist base and slaughtered everyone there, including one of the swordsmen. She lowered her eyelids to look at him through her lashes. What do you have to fear from us? Minato could see that tale was getting taller with every retelling. That was a war. I'm not keen to open up the opportunity for trouble until I have to. Then we can arrange a meeting on neutral ground. Give me that map. She snapped her fingers at Gekko, who obeyed at the speed of sludge. Here. This is open ground, low altitude, no forest or rocks to hide behind. You meet with the captain here, and you may bring 2 of your best, no more or less. Is that satisfactory? I have a good nose, you know, he said, tapping it. And traps have this distinctive smell. Our captain is placing himself in greater danger than you. No one wants to get on the wrong side of the yellow flash. Do you think we're stupid enough to try something? This is Captain Kusanagi we're talking about, look him up in the bingo book. He's hardly on par with someone like you. She was working hard to flatter him. It was disappointing, really. They'd gotten along so well, exchanging gifts or rabbit fur gloves, and now this. Well, like him, she was a dog to her masters. She had her orders and Minato had, well, he didn't really have any orders. Whatever he decided to do next was up to him. Fine, he said eventually. I'll meet your man in an hour. An hour? She blurted. Problem? Or do you need more time to dig the tiger pits? She rose swiftly, offended. An hour it is. Lovely speaking with you again, Minato-kun. Enjoy your retirement, as we may not see each other again. She swept out of the cabin with her guard and Gecko finally released the sneeze she'd been holding in. Oh, my sinuses, she moaned. You're in for a bit of luck then, Gekko-kun, he told her. We're going to take a trip down the mountain. She sniffed. You're not really going to meet this captain, are you? I've heard of Kusanagi. He may not be strong, but his strength is as a tactician. We'll need to get to the meeting point first to scope it out before they arrive, he said, ignoring her warning. Get Yuhi. You'll do for two of my best. This is bad, Gecko muttered as she stalked out. Bad, but oh, it will be nice to be able to breathe oxygen again. Until her voice faded into the ambience of the base. They're coming, Commander. Yuhi passed him the binoculars, and from the safe cover of the forest edge, Minato looked on at the two men arriving on the other side of the wide-open fell. There indeed was the diminutive figure of Captain Kusanagi. Beside him was a gigantically tall man with a mighty scowl on his face. Oh, Minato mumbled. What? Gecko squinted around the tree to no effect. That looks like A to me, he said, passing the binoculars back to Yuhi for confirmation. What's A? Gecko looked at Yuhi. A is the name of someone I don't wish to tangle with, Yuhi admitted. He's tipped to be the next Raikage. Is he in the bingo book? Gecko asked. Definitely, Minato sighed. At the sound of flipping pages the two men turned to look at Gecko in disbelief. You still carry that thing around with you? Yuhi hissed, pointing at her bingo book. Yes, and look how useful it is, she said. Ah, here we are. Right at the beginning of the section on Kumo, of course. Let's see, ah. Very strong. Well, it's good to see that book wasn't totally a dead weight, Yuhi said sarcastically. Minato resumed watching the men while his subordinates bickers back and forth over his head. It says here that his brother is a Jinchuriki, she went on. The Eight Tails, no less. It says he was the latest in a long line of hosts, previous ones proving to be dangerous and unstable and, oh boy, now you can kinda see why they stayed out of the last war. Their village has been destroyed repeatedly by that thing. You'd think they'd just give up Jinchuriki as more trouble than they're worth, but oh no. How is that useful right now? Yuhi demanded. Maybe we could exploit his sensitivity over his brother, she suggested. Nothing about that guy looks sensitive, Minato said grimly. K tells us about Kusanagi but forgets to mention someone like A. This is definitely a trap. Damn it. Neither of them had ever heard him swear before, even as mildly as that, and their argument died swiftly. We should retreat in that case, Yuhi advised. Minato groaned. It's too late. Making a move like this, they're declaring their intentions toward Konoha. If we avoid a confrontation now, we'll just have it later and things will deteriorate from there. And I was that close to retirement. Damn it. So what do we do? Gecko asked nervously. Minato sighed and reached out to pluck the bingo book from her hands and hand her one of his kunai instead. She looked at it in awe. We're going to proceed, he told them. But if things go bad, I want you two to get out of there. Gecko's mouth dropped open. But, you have to obey, he said shortly. Yuhi may have looked like he wanted to object to, but he had the sense and experience to tell the difference between an order and a suggestion. Once Gecko had subsided and he was sure she understood her responsibility, he stood. Let's go. They began their approach across the barren plain, towards the two men waiting for them at the center. It was a fairly neutral meeting ground, far enough from any cover that had either party hidden reinforcements in the trees or behind the rocks on the slope. They would be too far away to act effectively. But why would Kusanagi have needed to hide backups when he had the strongest man in Kumo at his side? "I'm honored you agreed to see me," said Kusanagi as Minato and his subordinates stopped several meters away, close enough to conduct a conversation without shouting, but not too close they couldn't react to sudden movements. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't show up." Though Minato could see he was older than the Hokage, this didn't make him any less harmless, and whether if it was his position in the Kumo hierarchy or the devious calculating smile he wore when he laid eyes on Minato, something about him strongly resembled Danzu. He knew at least that this was not a man to be trusted. "What is it you want?" Minato asked, cutting right to the point. Kusanagi smirked like he appreciated his straightforwardness. "What we want, and what Outrageage wants, is a prisoner exchange. Your emissary led me to believe this was over the accusations of kidnapping," said Minato, looking at the arsenal attached to A's belt. That was quite a lot of specialist tools for a peaceful meeting. Kei was not informed as to the nature of this contact, Kusanagi said dismissively. "She was providing her own conjecture at best, though she said you were a reasonable sort of man and would be willing to assist us in this matter." "I'm just commander of a small outpost of no real strategic importance," Minato told him. "I don't see as how I can be much help to you. I wasn't aware that Konoha holds any member of Kumo prisoner, or of Kumo holding anyone from Konoha." "Oh, we're not holding anyone," Kusanagi said, his smirk widening to show his worn teeth and pale gums. "Not yet." Wearily, he nodded. "I think I understand." "Do you really?" Kusanagi sneered at him. Kill the other two, we won't be needing them." Moved, faster than a man his size had a right to. Two kunai appeared, flashing through the air towards each of Minato's subordinates, and before either of them reacted Minato threw himself forward. He caught one, snatching it out of the air and hurled it to intercept the other. The kunai gave a loud crack as they met in midair, and Yuhi took a stunned step back as the two weapons flew past his ear. "Go," Minato called to them. "Now." Gekko hesitated. Taicho. Suddenly A was before him, appearing like a crack of thunder with dust billowing around them. One large hand slammed down atop Minato's hand with almost enough force to shatter his spine. "Go!" Minato shouted again, a second before he was smashed face first into the ground. He didn't hear much over the intense ringing in his ears after that, but enough to understand his situation. "This is really the yellow flash," he heard a comment. "That was too easy. Awfully quick to abandon their commander, weren't they?" he heard Kusanagi chortle. "But I suppose Konoha is not known for its bravery." His hands were tied into fists behind his back and a gag jammed into his mouth. Over his head went a cloth bag that stunk horribly of something sweet and medicinal, and Minato remained conscious only long enough to feel himself being lifted up into the air and laid on someone's strong shoulder before succumbing to the cloying darkness. Hours passed in what felt like a suffocating black ocean. Confusing sounds and images blurred across his senses, and every time he came close to breaking the surface the current snatched him back down again where it was quieter and his thoughts slower. He was tossed relentlessly between unconsciousness and semi-aware, until suddenly an icy shock washed over him and he snapped awake with a gasp. He was freezing and soaking wet, and for a moment all he could make out were the legs of the Nin before him and the dripping bucket dangling in view. The feet retreated and a hard metal door slammed shut, leaving him alone to gather him scattered wits in privacy. Minato inched himself upright, shoulders aching from being tied behind his back, but not nearly as much as his hands. Konoha went to great lengths to stop a prisoner using jutsu by temporarily sealing their chakra points, which allowed moderate freedom of movement without much danger. Kumo, however, was still perfectly willing to sacrifice prisoner comfort for convenience. If you couldn't seal up a prisoner's chakra points, wrapping hands so tightly he couldn't move even a finger worked just as well even if the cramps were inevitable. Minato winced now, but he could tell his bonds would only get more and more painful if they weren't loosened. His room was small, lined with breeze blocks bearing all kinds of stains and scratches as if there had been many in here before him, and the floor smelt strongly of old urine. He doubted he'd been transported all the way to Kumo, nor did this feel like the Kumo outpost near his own. Judging by the faint throbbing in his skull and how no matter how long he panted he couldn't seem to catch his breath, he was at a far higher altitude than either base. His scouts had identified a few small, hidden bunkers further up in the mountains, so this was most likely where he'd been taken. Chances were this was one they hadn't discovered yet, so the odds of his outpost locating him any time soon was dismal to say the least. The next time the door opened, Kusanagi stepped in with a glass of water and a pill in his hand. "And how are we today?" Perhaps the old man wanted him to question his sense of time or something, but Minato was certain only a few hours had passed since he'd been knocked out. Possibly certain. Maybe. "If you think I'm going to take anything you give me," Minato said, eyeing the pill. "Think again. It's up to you. It's merely a treatment for altitude sickness, and your symptoms are apparent," said the old bastard cheerfully. "It wouldn't do to have you dropping dead on our hands. Death by fluid accumulation in the muscles and brain is not very nice. If that's going to be a problem for you, why don't we take a trip down to sea level?" Minato suggested. "I don't think we'll be moving you after this point," said Kusanagi. "Right now Konoha is pouring people into the neutral territory. Seems your Hokage is trying to provoke us." "Kidnapping and imprisoning one of his jonin was pretty provocative too," Minato responded. "Are you trying to start a war?" "Konoha already started it by sanctioning the abduction and slaughter of our citizens." "Ah. That old chestnut." "Yes." "Ah." Kusanagi crouched and thrust the pill into Minato's mouth. He forced him to swallow by forcing his head up and pouring the war between his lips, but he needn't have bothered. Minato didn't resist too much, knowing that if Kusanagi had wanted him dead they wouldn't have come to the meeting armed with ropes and gags and everything else from the handbook of abduction, short of a great big burlap sack. It may have been a sedative, though Minato couldn't see the point of waking him just to put him back to sleep again, or it may have been some kind of truth serum, though he knew of none that were particularly effective in pill form. It was most likely exactly what Kusanagi said it was, and as the minutes passed and he grew less lightheaded and felt less like the victim of an all-night bender, he knew the pill was working. Kusanagi left him alone during that time, returning an uncertain number of hours later to strut up and down the cell, eyeing Minato proudly like he was some kind of trophy. Which, he supposed, was exactly what he was. "You're nothing like I imagined," he said. "I knew you would be young, but somehow I thought you would be taller. I at least thought you might hold your own against A for more than a few seconds but, alas, that's probably not your fault. It says more about A than it says about you. Here is the man who defeated one of the 7 swordsmen in his own base, defeated by one of our own in the blink of an eye." Minato shrugged. "Can't win them all. Well, I'm glad to see your ego isn't too badly bruised. Although your face from where it hit the ground, not quite the pretty-boy anymore. Well, there was some good news, at least." "What is it you want from me?" Minato asked him. "Or is this really just part of a plan to provoke open war?" Kusanagi resumed pacing in his superior predatory way. "As I said, what we want is a prisoner exchange. It's quite simple. Simple, except that we have no Kumo prisoners. You're one up on us right now." "Ah, well, who said we wanted one of our own back?" Kusanagi asked, leering at him. "We've caught ourselves one of the biggest fish in the sea, but don't be too full of yourself. You're merely bait for an even bigger fish. We've sent out demands to the Hokage, we'll see how he replies." "I'm just bait?" "How insulting," Minato murmured. Who are you hoping they'll give you in exchange for my life? The Hokage would probably give his own son to recover someone like you, Kusanagi chortled. We could name anyone and he'd hand them over. Minato had trouble imagining the Hokage handing over even the lowliest street sweeper in exchange for Minato. But you obviously have someone particular in mind. Don't we just? Kusanagi stepped forward and plunged his hand inside Minato's vest and into pockets he must have become familiar with while his prisoner was unconscious, because the old man knew exactly which pocket to reach for. Suddenly the photo Minato kept there was on the floor, and the bright-faced redhead smiling back at him was at total odds with the grimy canvas Kusanagi had dropped her on. Imagine our surprise to find her picture on you. I didn't expect you to even know her name, let alone be her lover. An unexpected development to be sure, but a very welcome one. Lovers are always such noble creatures. If she really loves you, she'll be offering herself to us soon enough. Kushina? Minato demanded loudly. I'm bait to catch Kushina. What the hell do you? He stopped short, his baffled shock only lasting a moment. He kept forgetting his girlfriend wasn't just a hot-headed ex-refugee. With poor ninjutsu fundamentals and excellent specialization in elemental jutsu, adding up to a better-than-average fighter with magnificent hair. For Kyumo to want that girl was nonsensical, but then Kushina was the only girl he knew with a secret big enough to rock whole nations. For Kyumo to be interested in her, they had to know something. But Minato had to tread carefully. If they didn't have the whole picture, he wouldn't be filling in the missing pieces for them. What's so interesting about Uzumaki Kushina? He asked more evenly, watching the photograph. She was intensely camera shy, so it had taken a while to get his hands on this one, courtesy of photographer Uchiha Mikoto, who had proven herself to be remarkably good at capturing shy creatures in their natural habitat, and he hated to see it tossed on the dirty floor like a piece of rubbish. Kusanagi straightened, lip curled in disbelief. As if you don't know, he said, and to add insult to injury stepped on Minato's photograph. It was better to save his anger for if or when something happened to the real Kushina, but Kusanagi was just lucky that Minato's hands were tied behind his back, or he would have been sporting a very bloody nose right then. This is one of the most valuable people alive, we're talking about, Kusanagi went on. Far more valuable than you'll ever be, for however celebrated you are, you're still just the son of a whore. As shinobi go, this girl is practically royalty. Not only is she the daughter of Uzushiogekure's leader, she's a direct blood descendant of the founding clan. There's few like her left. That's great, Minato responded with a bored drawl, but if you're hoping to get a better ransom for her, the name Uzumaki doesn't mean that much to anyone anymore. You're better off sticking with me. You think this is about ransom? We're not as crass and desperate as that. If this was about money, I grudgingly admit that you are the more profitable prisoner, even though in a just world people would see you are nothing but mud next to the gleaming gem that is Uzumaki Kushina. I should put that in my next Valentine card, observed Minato. She'd love that. Well, when you send it, don't forget her change of address. By next February she'll be with us. Minato nodded vaguely. And what will you do with her when she so generously gives herself to you? Oh, now that is a good question. Kusanagi practically quivered as he looked down at Kushina's photograph, and Minato had known enough perverts to recognize the kind of thoughts running through his captor's head, and they were not harmless. Only when he felt the straps around his hands cut deeper into his flesh did he realize he was trying to flex his fists. Kusanagi noticed. Don't be so dramatic, he derided. We'd have no intention of harming her. As I said, she's a royal jewel who would be a great asset to us. There are things she knows, things only she has access to that we need. This had to be about her father's sealing techniques. Somehow they'd found out, or they'd deduced that the daughter was the current caretaker of her father's techniques, and if they couldn't get to her directly in Konoha, they'd gone through Minato instead. The only reason Kusanagi was speaking with him now was to prod him to see what he knew, but Minato was good at playing dumb. What the hell would Kushina know that would matter to you? I love her dearly, but she was bottom of the class at school, and no matter how many times I explain it, she still thinks you can find the base of a rainbow if you run towards it. What a memorable Sunday afternoon that had been. You can't fool me, young man. When Konoha protects her so jealously, it is clear that they know her worth, and as her lover she would most definitely confide in you. Confide what? Minato demanded impatiently, like someone who truly didn't know what was going on. Kusanagi must have doubted, just a little bit, how much Minato knew, or that flash of irritation wouldn't have made the powdery lines around his eyes deepen and he wouldn't have gone on to explain. Surely you know of the disaster that destroyed the Whirlpool village. Sure, Minato said with a shrug. The civil war happened and then, no. Kusanagi all but screamed at him, like a tyrannical teacher at a child who couldn't add 2 and 2 together. The disaster that killed their second leader and wiped half the village off the map. What, the tsunami? Minato honestly struggled to remember. It had been alluded to in the history books he read, but it seemed like they'd all had different ideas of what happened. Or was it some kind of hurricane? Tsunami? Hurricane? Now teacher was really enraged. It was a bijou, you brat. And nothing less than the 9-tailed fox, the most terrible of all the tailed beasts. What are they teaching you young people in Konoha these days? Minato didn't believe it for a second. Kushina would have mentioned something as calamitous as that, and who knew if that thing even existed? It was a bedtime story used to scare children. Adults were supposed to grow out of believing those kinds of things. By all rights that village should have fallen into the sea and every soul should have perished, Kusanagi continued, pushed into full lecture mode. Except one man stood up and put an end to its wrath, and a Jinchuriki was born that day. This is a fairy tale, Minato said. That man's daughter knows who the 9-tailed Jinchuriki is. Either she knows, or she is. That's enough. This is absurd. Minato shouted, his bonds biting painfully into him again. If you're insinuating Kushina is a Jinchuriki. That is exactly what I'm saying. Then you need your head seeing too. Minato ground out savagely, thrusting his chin at the photo of the shyly smiling girl who couldn't have been further from the grotesque husk he'd seen in Suna. Does she look like a Jinchuriki to you? Do you think I would date a freak like that? Every bit of his anger was genuine, and Kusanagi appeared to pause and reassess him. It would make sense, he said. She's from a clan whose chakra makes them almost perfectly suited to become hosts. The 9-tailed fox didn't disappear into thin air, and if a Jinchuriki was created, it's someone from her clan. If there was ever a fox, Minato retorted, making it clear he was doing nothing more than entertaining a hypothetical. Why would Kushina know where it is now? Her village is scattered, she knows no one from her own clan that survived, or she wouldn't have been dropped in an orphanage in Konoha without a penny to that great name of hers. Which makes her our primary suspect. That's ridiculous. What kind of father would turn his own child into a monster? What indeed? This conversation had obviously not gone the way Kusanagi had hoped. With hooded eyes he turned back to the door, and through the grill Minato thought he glimpsed a watching them silently. His question might as well have been what kind of brother would do that to his sibling, for here was one such person. Minato couldn't understand that. Jinchuriki couldn't be controlled, and Kyumo should have known better than anyone what kind of destruction they wrought. Why hand someone of your own family over to that? Was the search for power so ruthless that sacrificing your own brother was considered an honor? Kusanagi turned back to him. If she can't give us what we want, it doesn't matter. We have other uses for someone with chakra like hers, he said, gesturing for A to open the door. We acquired the 2-tailed cat recently and it needs a host. Minato told him exactly what he thought of that in a string of expletives that would have made his subordinates faint in shock if they heard him now. Kusanagi smirked and stepped out of the cell, but only after he'd scooped Kushina's picture off the floor to take with him, and the moment it was closed behind him the grill snapped shut and the light above Minato was switched off. He was left in that darkness for the rest of the week. Convinced that he knew nothing relevant, Kusanagi no longer came to see him, and the only other contact he had were the people who gingerly stepped in once a day to leave a plate of dry rations and a glass of water at his knee. But once they were gone he was back alone in the darkness, left trying to figure out how to take a sip of water with his hands tied behind his back. He managed, even if most of it did end up on the floor. They wouldn't keep ignoring him forever. He was banking on that, and in the meantime the meager food and drink was enough to sustain him. The occasional pill saw off the worst of the headaches, but he was fast acclimatizing to his new position in more ways than one. It gave him plenty of time to think, at least. If the darkness was supposed to be depressing and disturb his sense of time, Minato found it quiet and contemplative. He spent hours musing about what everyone he knew would be doing. His substitute would be getting more than he bargained for right about now, running the outpost and no doubt sending out hectic search parties. Gekko would be feeling nauseous no doubt, and Yuhi would be blaming himself. Somewhere in Konoha the Hokage would have been notified by now, and while his nephew was probably pumping his fist in joy, what would Kushina be feeling? Was she terribly worried and camping out by the letterbox in the morning to hear news of him? Or was at that moment packing his belongings in boxes and shipping them off to charity to teach him a lesson about not taking his leave? Knowing Kushina, he could trust her to be unpredictable. It was roughly 7 or 8 meals later, his only marker for the passage of days, when his cell door opened and none other than A himself walked in with his plate of squashed rice cubes and vegetables. "Thank you," Minato said graciously, like he would to one of his subordinates who had brought him a fresh coffee. "Just leave it over there on the floor as usual and I'll mash my face into it when I get the chance." A paused, frowning faintly in annoyance. Perhaps he had planned to drop the food off like the others without a word, but instead he came right over to Minato, crouched, and held out the glass in offering. "My hands are a bit tied at the moment," Minato explained dryly. "Then tip your head back," said A, idiot. Taking a drink from a glass without holding it precariously between his teeth made a welcome change. Most of it ended up down his throat this time, and when A lifted one of the rice balls to his mouth he almost smiled. "Now you're just spoiling me. Since you decided to lodge with us, we might as well roll out the 5-star treatment," said A. It may have been a joke, but when he never lost that peevish expression it was hard to tell. "Pardon?" Minato asked, chewing. "You must think I'm some kind of idiot." Minato wisely decided to say nothing. "For someone who made his reputation out of speed, you sure were as slow as snail shit out there," he said, cramming the next ball of rice into Minato's mouth before he could swallow the first. "I don't like being played, and I really don't like being taken lightly. You gave up without throwing a single punch." Minato fought hard to swallow. "My head was embedded in the mountain," he reminded him. "Because the moment you realized we were there to take you alive, you let me get my hands on you." Plate empty, A tapped its edge against the concrete floor as he stared Minato over with deep dislike and suspicion. "You're here because you want to be here. You're right. This is much better accommodation than the barracks." Minato's voice ran thick with sarcasm. "How could I pass up the opportunity?" A rose to his feet. "Kusanagi isn't as smart as he thinks he is," he said. "But neither are you. Maybe next time you want to give a more authentic performance you'll bother to put up a fight." He left the cell, but before shutting the grill in the door he looked in once more at Minato's scowling face. "I have my eye on you," he said with droll finality, and then that was that for all the human contact Minato would have that day. His patience was rewarded, however, when early the next morning Kusanagi stormed into his cell. Minato woke at the sound of the pounding footsteps and levered himself upright in time to have a scroll smashed over his sleepy face. Another bruise to add to his growing collection, he thought. "Refused," was Kusanagi's shrilly shout. The Hokage refuses to trade for you. You really expected anything different? Minato wondered aloud. Maybe that kind of ruthless prioritization was common in the Kyumo elite, but Minato had known from the beginning that the Hokage would never buy out one life with another. At the end of the day he was a Jonin and expected to fend for himself. His job was to protect his Chunin subordinates, not expect them to throw themselves on a sword for him, especially not his Chunin girlfriend. Foolish nobility. Kusanagi spat. Or else he thinks her more valuable than you. No matter either way, he has signed your death certificate since you're no longer any use to us. Get him up. This last order was barked at the two men, previously seen delivering his daily meals, who came in from the corridor. Now they were going to deliver him somewhere, and they both hauled him up by his aching shoulders and dragged him out of the cell. It felt blazingly bright compared to all those days in the dark cell. What do you plan to do with me? He asked quite calmly of Kusanagi, who followed closely behind them. You're no use now except as a source of information, his captor said coldly. We'll keep you alive for a few days, on enough drugs you'll be spilling all your most intimate secrets, and then we'll kill you and dissect you and find out how someone from such low origins became the Yellow Flash. You're breaking the peace treaty, Minato warned him as he was shoved and shuffled through a narrow doorway into a new room occupied by a single wooden chair. If you torture and kill me, it'll be war. It's already war. Kyumo is already planning to invade Konoha before the month is out. In the slaughter you'll be forgotten. Just another casualty. Put him in the chair. Minato was dumped unceremoniously into the seat, and as his two escorts took up position flanking the door, Kusanagi moved to a small, neat table set up by the wall. From where he sat, Minato could see several syringes laid out in a clinical metal tray. Truth serum, is it? He guessed. Such a heavy-handed and imprecise method to gather intelligence, Kusanagi admitted. But we shan't waste too much time on this. You've been the commander of your little outpost for a while now, and your best information is no doubt 2 years out of date by now, but there are some things I'd like to know that I can't learn from your dead body. The drugs will feel like they're burning you from the inside out, so to save yourself desperate agony, do you feel talkative? Ask away, he said. How did you kill General Akuz when you were 16? Kusanagi picked up one syringe and squeezed the plunged until a few beads of orange liquid wept from the needle's tip. How was that possible? Minato had a feeling he was going to be stuck with that needle no matter how fast and honestly he talked. I killed him in his bed. He was asleep. So you simply snuck into his bedroom like an underhanded dog? Kusanagi asked, disbelief etched in every line of his face. I'm a ninja. Underhanded dogs was what they were. Only the samurai maintained standards of honor and noble conduct, which was why there weren't many of them left. Touché. So you just snuck in. How disappointing. Oh, no, Minato interrupted. I had to use Hiration. It was actually very tricky. Hiration, Kusanagi seized upon that name greedily. The technique you're named for. Tell me, how does it work? Minato rolled his head to one side, debating whether or not to freely give away the secret of his most prized jutsu. Not even Kushina was privy to the details, though it had to be said her eyes glazed over with boredom whenever he talked about it. Deciding there was little harm at this point, he shrugged his indifference. I make a mark and imbue it with my chakra, and then I can move freely between points providing there is a mark. It's faster than light and noiseless. I fought Akuz in his own base and planted a mark on his chest. When he finally let his guard down, I returned and stabbed him through the heart. I need details, Kusanagi demanded. How do these marks operate? How can you move between them faster than light? Minato searched for the right words, even though it wasn't something that could truly be explained with the limited vocabulary of language. I suppose if you consider time and space in one-dimensional form, as one long line that we slog through in its natural linear flow, Hiration bends the line at 2 points and makes a loop, taking 2 points in space and converging them into 1 point in time. If I place many marks, the line becomes a series of loops. The best way I can explain it is that it becomes the shape of a flower with petals. While everyone else must walk the furthest edges of the petal's outline, I move from point to point in the center of the flower where the petals meet. I can move forward through space without moving through time, making travel instantaneous, if you get my meaning. Minato was treated to a very familiar glazed stare. What hand seals do you use? I used to use hand seals, but they're not necessary anymore. And how do you place these marks? I can draw them for permanent ones. For temporary one-use marks I just touch my hand to an object, or a surface, or a person. I don't even have to use my hand these days, my foot is pretty good. And the range of this technique? The syringe in Kusunagi's hand was drooping, forgotten. Many miles. For instance, I'm currently connected to a tag in my outpost. How many miles away is that? 12, said Kusunagi uncertainly. Then my range is over 12 miles at the very least. His captor was beginning to look increasingly confused, gesturing to something invisible on his left, and then to his right like he was adding the pieces up. But, he said slowly, if you don't need to use your hands and you're connected to a tag in your outpost, what's stopping you leaving right now? Minato broke out into his first true smile. Nothing. Nothing. Kusunagi repeated slowly. Then why are you still here? Curiosity. But I think I've learned everything I needed to know, so thank you. A beat passed where Kusunagi remained absolutely motionless. Then in an instant his muscles coiled and he lunged forward with the syringe, aiming for Minato's neck. The needle stabbed the back of the chair and snapped, its little fragments falling onto the empty seat. Kusunagi gave a roar of anger and frustration, which went unheard by Minato who, 12 miles away, had just landed in Gekko's lap. Her shriek of shock was far more piercing. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.